I hope you're all well. Today we're going to be focusing on elasticity. Okay, so let's jump right in. So, elasticity is essentially a measure of responsiveness of one variable to a change in another. So, specifically to economics, when we change the price of something, what happens to the amount that's demanded? So it naturally, you guys know that according to the law of demand, if the price of something decreases, the demand increases. But if we were to take it at a more quantitative level, if we were to say that we were increasing the price by 1%, would that result in a 1% change in the quantity demanded? Or would it result in a 10% change? Or would it be a negative change? Would there be no change? In which case you have an inelastic market, a market that is unresponsive to price changes. So we're going to explore these different types of elasticity and how they impact your everyday economic decisions. So here is the formula, because of course there is always math in economics. So despite being a social science, it's still very important that people are at the forefront of every economics decision and every economic choice. So when we're talking about microeconomics, we are talking about how people respond to a change in price. So we react differently to different products. So, for example, if there is a 10% increase in petrol, it doesn't necessarily mean that there would be a commensurate change in the quantity demanded because it is an essential good. Okay, so how we typically measure this responsiveness is by saying, okay, here's the formula. The percentage change in the quantity demanded over the percentage change in the price of the product. Okay, so the actual definition of price elasticity, specifically of demand, is that it measures the percentage change in quantity if there is a price change of 1%. Okay, so it's also very important to understand that no matter what the outcome of this formula, your result must always be converted to a positive value because we only measure elasticity. So what you're essentially doing is you're putting the percentage change in quantity and the percentage change in price into a ratio. So we only are looking at it from 0 to like positive values. Okay, so from 0 onwards. So the formula itself uses percentage change. Okay, so if you are looking at it as a graph, you're looking at the incline, you're looking at the gradient. So the answer from the calculation is called the elasticity coefficient, and it's the ratio between the percentage change in quantity and the percentage change in price. So the coefficient tells the reader how consumers respond to any change in price for a specific product. So when we're calculating the price elasticity of demand, we have to ignore the negative sign. We are only interested in the value. So this is what it looks like on the graph. As you can see, it's very similar to your usual demand curve. It has price on the y-axis and it has quantity on the x-axis. The gradient of this demand curve is how we depict elasticity. Why? Because a small change in price can result in a significant drop in quantity. In fact, a greater drop in quantity. Okay, so we use this formula to determine how price sensitive our consumers are to our product. So if you have a very steep demand curve, it means that you are relatively inelastic, which means that you can raise prices and have a relatively small impact on quantity demanded. But if you've got quite an elastic demand, it means that any small change in price is going to have a monumental effect on your quantity demanded, on your market. So if you're thinking about the products this would be impacted by, okay, so for example, if you're looking at hotel rooms, okay, so let's look at the same product, but with specifically different demand elasticities. So if you're in the middle of the Sahara Desert, and you're in a specific hotel, little resort. Okay, it's built on an oasis. There is nothing around you for 100 kilometers, and they then, as you arrive, decide that they're going to increase the price by 100%. Would that, okay, you've just gotten there after trekking through the desert. There's nothing around for ages. What would that do to your quantity demanded? Probably not much. Okay. There is no competition. There's no alternatives. You have no option. So you are completely at the will of the dealer. If they increase their price by 200%, you'd still need to stay there for the night. You'd be upset about it, but you'd still need to stay there. On the other hand, if you're visiting the bustling town of Cape Town, you could move into our hotel. They then say, I'm so sorry, we have to increase your price by 100%. All you do is walk out, find another hotel around the corner, and problem solved. You would never have to pay an exorbitant price in a market full of competition. So even the same product, given different circumstances, can have vastly different elasticities. Obviously, this is very different for different products as well. So you can have a Dolce & Gabbana bag, which if you were to increase the price, there's a very good chance that you'd increase the quantity demanded because then people would say it's a limited edition. It's even more premium than the premium. Okay, so different products react differently to changes in price. So when we're talking about interpreting these different elasticity coefficients, which is the result of the formula inputs. So for example, if we get a elasticity coefficient of 1.8, that means that a 1% price change leads to a 1.8% decrease in the quantity demanded. So there are absolute values. Okay, so we're not concerned with any negative signs. I've mentioned that once or twice before, but again, it's the 1.8 we're concerned with. Okay, so if something has the elasticity coefficient of 0.5, what would that indicate about the consumer behavior? It means that a 1% increase in price would lead to a 0.5% decrease in quantity demanded. Now, as you can see, because they all fall on a range from 0 to 1, or actually, it can go quite a bit higher. It can go from 1 to infinity, but all of these different coefficients are categorized. So if you have a perfectly elastic market, that means that you have an infinitely high coefficient. That means that any minute increase in price will have a devastating impact on your market. You could also have a relatively elastic market. That is anything from 1 and slightly above to infinity. So relatively elastic means, again, a 1% increase in price can have a 1% or more impact on your quantity demanded. If you have unitary elasticity, it means that a 1% increase in price results in a 1% decrease in quantity demanded. Okay, they're one for one. I'll show you what all of these look like in graphs, but this is what they all are represented at formulaically. So relatively inelastic. So now we're going to the other side. So that is anything between 0 and 1. That means that you have an entirely different demand curve almost, because you can increase your price without impacting the quantity demanded. So a 1% increase in price has a 0 to 1% decrease in the quantity demanded. Okay, that means that the power is predominantly in the hands of the producers. So you could also have a perfectly inelastic demand, okay, in which case you can raise your prices as much as you want and you would have no impact on quantity demanded. Okay, so an example of that is things like electricity, petrol. Fewer people can afford it, but essentially not going to change the demand very much because, again, it is a necessity. So, as soon as you start falling into the necessity products, that's when you start getting your perfectly inelastic. When you start getting into the non-luxury goods, things you'd like to buy, that's when they're perfectly elastic. Also, things like different bread companies competing, if they increase their price by 0.5%, it could make them 50% more expensive, 50 cents more expensive, and that's enough to shift you to another brand. Okay, if the differences are not significant. Okay, so we have looked at what they look like formulaically. Now we're going to look at what they look like graphically. So here you can see the different price elasticities. In graph A, you have a perfectly inelastic demand. So if you were to increase your prices by 10%, it would have zero impact on demand. That curve is not moving. So that indicates a price elasticity of 0. Products that fall into that category tend to be rather addictive. So if you're looking at, say, cigarettes or alcohol, they could increase the prices. It generally doesn't impact the quantity that is demanded significantly. Then you can have your elastic demand. That's when a 10% increase in the price of the unit results in a 15% decrease in the quantity demanded. So you have had a substantially greater drop in quantity demanded as a result of the increase in price. So if you have an inelastic demand, you have the opposite reaction. You can increase, this is significant, especially for your assignment 2, where we look at, I believe, hotel rooms, and you have a 10% increase in price and yet a relatively small decrease in quantity demanded by 2%. We'll look at how different companies can maximize the revenue aspect with regards to this demand. Because, of course, if a 10% increase only results in a 2% decrease in quantity demanded, it is very likely that you would raise your prices and that you can without impacting your market at all. Then you have perfectly elastic demands. Okay, so those are obviously any price change will result in an infinite change in your quantity demanded. So that is when your margins are so tight that you really can't. For example, the paper industry lives on these very tight margins. Airlines as well, they're very tight margins because the fuel costs are so high, maintenance costs are so high. With paper, there isn't a lot of margin that can be sort of brought into it. And essentially, if you end up in a price war, it's a race to the bottom. So they have a perfectly elastic demand. On the other hand, you could have unitary elasticity. That is when a 10% increase in price results in just a 10% decrease in quantity demanded. Obviously, that is a beautifully predictable market, very rare in actual economic times. It will generally be slightly higher or slightly lower. So now we did look at when we were looking at the hotel scenario with a 10% possible increase in price with only a 2% drop in quantity, we have to also look at total revenue. So, how, if you are in that situation, can you maximize your revenue as a company? So, obviously, you know the total revenue is the price multiplied by the quantity of all the units you've sold. So if you have an elastic demand, the way to decrease your total revenue is to increase your price. Okay, so again, if you have an elastic demand, that means that increasing your price by 10% is going to result in a at least 15% drop in the quantity demanded. So that is how you would overall lose money. Okay, if people can have a lot of options, the worst thing you can do in a competitive market is raise your prices and essentially push people to your competition. If you have an inelastic demand, however, by increasing your price, you are very minimally impacting the quantity that's demanded. So you can maximize your total revenue by demanding more from your consumers. If you have a unitary elasticity scenario, then total revenue remains constant because every increase in price is going to result in an equal decrease in quantity demand. Now, it's very important to understand that these different price elasticities can actually be identified along the same linear demand curve. So the reason that this relationship exists is because they are a demand curve. So as the price decreases, as you can see, it is just a standard demand curve in essence. So as your price increases, so your quantity decreases, and as your price comes down, so your quantity increases. Now along this curve, there are different scenarios. So right here, you can see at point C, we have unitary elasticity. Okay. That is when elasticity coefficient equals 1. So a 1% increase in price will result in a 1% decrease in quantity demanded. Over here, we have a inelastic demand at point B. I'm sorry, a very elastic demand at point B because it has a high elasticity coefficient. In which case, a relatively small change in price will result in a monumental shift in quantity. Okay, obviously at point A, we have reached perfectly elastic, so any change in price results in a zero quantity being demanded. Over here on the other side of point C, we have point D. Again, this is a very inelastic demand. You can see here at this price of 2 Rand, this product is reacting very inelastically. You can increase this price at this point, and still the same amount of people, or very few people, would switch away from your product. This is essentially the Amazon tactics. What they do is they move into your market, they undercut your prices to a ridiculous level. And once they have moved you out of the market and destroyed your business and taken all of your market share, then they can start increasing their prices with no competition, essentially back into a blue ocean strategy, which means there is no competition. Okay, and at point E over here, you have perfect inelasticity, at which point you can increase your price from 0 to any price above that from this point, and you would have no impact on the quantity demanded. You have got the heart of your consumer. They're going to stick with you. Now, there are different formula that apply to price elasticity. You will receive a formula sheet in the exam. And the differences are, I'm just laid out here. We will look at that in more detail. However, your assignment does not include either of these. It is a simple elasticity calculation, just change in quantity over change in price. But nonetheless, we will look at these very briefly here. So arc elasticity assumes that there is a curve to your demand, in which case it uses the midpoints for the price and quantity. So if you are encounter a scenario where you're given multiple points on the curve, so you have different prices and different quantities, then it's very likely that you'll have to use the midpoint instead of using either of the price and quantity, especially if it's for the same product. Then there's point elasticity. So this uses a version of calculus because we're looking at an instant of elasticity at a specific point. Both still aim to measure responsiveness of demand to price changes. Now we're going to look at the determinants of price elasticity. Okay, so we look at substitution possibilities, degree of complementary products, type of want that needs to be satisfied, time consideration, and we're going to look at each of these in the next 5 slides. So starting on page 112, you will start to see how these different factors impact price elasticity of demand. So when it comes to substitution, we were looking at, for example, hotel rooms. In a scenario where there is no competition, no substitution, there is a greater chance that you will have an inelastic demand. Okay, if there is an increase in substitution, it will greatly increase your elasticity, which means that people become more responsive to price when there is a lot of competition and less responsive when there is less competition. Then we look at the degree of complementary products. So if the price elasticity of demands tends to be low if there's a high value of complementary goods. So goods that are often used together. So that means that a consumer will not easily stop buying a product, even if the price increases, if the good is required for the good you already own. Okay, so perfect example are tires and cars. So you've already bought the high value product in the car. If the tires need to be replaced, even if the tires are 25% of the car, at some point, okay, 25% is a bit high, say 5% of the car, you would still have to buy it. With all machinery, you'll have wear and tear where you have to replace different mechanical parts, but it can't stop you from buying the original product or from maintaining that product in the long run. Then there's the type of want that can be satisfied with the product. So the price elasticity of demand for necessity tends to be lower than the price elasticity for luxury goods, obviously. So when we're looking at bread, the elasticity is quite inelastic. Okay, we don't have a lot of wiggle room with the price of essentials that people need to survive. That's why they will, for example, raise VAT on every other product except essentials. So it's just because obviously of the societal benefits. Then you have the other side of the coin where you have more luxury goods and they tend to be relatively inelastic. More elastic. So if you don't have the disposable income to buy that new handbag, there's a very good chance that you'll just wait, and buy your want at a later stage when it's more easily affordable. The time period under consideration. So demands tend to be more price elastic in the long run than in the short run. So if you are considering petrol prices and petrol prices keep rising because of these random supply shocks in the economy, consumers will not be able to do anything about it and they'll be forced to pay the increased price in the short run. But in the long run, a lot of people will start looking at alternatives like perhaps either buying smaller cars or even electric cars. Um, so it's always time consideration. If you've invested a lot at the moment, and then, for example, solar panels with regards to electricity, a lot of people were willing to suffer the short-term impacts of load shedding, but after a decade, it starts to set in that this is probably going to be with us for a while, and then people start making major investments into their houses to get off the grid. Okay, so the proportion of the income that is spent on those products. So the greater the proportion, the greater the price elasticity of demand. So if you're going to spend a significant portion of your income, you will, give greater consideration to whether it's really necessary. The smaller the proportion, the less consideration, you give it. So it's easier to buy paper clips on your income than it is to buy a car. Okay, so it's all about that's how we classify these different products. The definition of the product itself. So the smaller the product, the more price elasticity tends to be. So for example, the elasticity for McDonald's chips would be greater than the elasticity of demand for food in general, like, or yeah, it's just like a particular food. Okay, so advertising also plays a role because, as you know, for example, there are people who will swear by their brand of bread or a specific brand of clothing. So advertising creates a lot of brand loyalty. The higher your brand loyalty, the less impact price changes have on you, which means the more inelastic your demand. You will demand your brand irrespective of price increases. The number of uses a product has. So the greater number of uses, the greater the price elasticity of demand tends to be. So a rise in the price of elasticity may cause consumers to switch to other means of cooking. So then electricity becomes less important, for things like heating and things like that. Durability, obviously, this feeds into time consideration. It's harder for people to buy things like a refrigerator, so they are more likely to be the more durable the good, the more price elastic the demand tends to be. And obviously, the more non-durable, the more inelastic the demand tends to be. Addiction. Okay, so the reason that we have to look at this is because a perfect inelastic demand is only really seen in products of addiction. So regardless of the price, people will demand this product. The other thing that we have is medication. Okay, for example, life-saving drugs like insulin. There was a huge scandal in the US a few years ago because drug companies were charging ridiculous amounts because they understood that these were life-saving drugs and that people had no other option. And because they had a perfectly inelastic demand, they could demand any price they wanted. Okay. Now we have different types of elasticity of demand. Okay, so there are a few. The first we're going to look at is income elasticity of demand. So this measures how the quantity demanded changes with the income. So, of course, you can see how these different aspects always impact demand. If you start generating additional income or your income increases by 20%, you're far more likely to demand more luxury goods, so less inferior goods. So you could also demand more of a good you enjoy than before. You could spend more money on luxury and less more money on luxury and less money on necessities. There are different examples of this. So income elasticity has a different formula. So again, percentage change in quantity is always at the top. The variables are the things that change at the bottom. So typically you have price at the bottom. This is specifically looking at what the impact is of a real change in income. So we use these percentages to track how responsive demanded quantity from consumers is to a change in income. So if you've got a positive value, you've got a normal good. Okay, so you typically see that if there's just a normal 1% increase in income, there will be a normal 1% increase in quantity demanded. It's just a typical good. If you have a negative value, so people have their income increase and then start demanding less from you, that means you have an inferior good. Do you understand that from a consumer, from a producer, this is very useful information to understand what your market looks like from a consumer standpoint. If you have a luxury good, you're looking at an income elasticity of greater than 1. That means that as your income increases, you will demand substantially more of a certain good. If your value falls between 0 and 1, it means that you have a necessity good. So your income increases and commensurate your quantity demanded increases, okay? But not significantly more. If your income increases, it doesn't mean you'd start demanding more salt. Okay, it is a necessity in your life, but increasing your income would not mean that you demand more of that specific type of product. Okay, then we have cross elasticity of demand. Okay, so cross elasticity primarily deals with complementary and substitute goods. So it measures how the quantity demanded of one good responds to the price changes in another, very much like the car and the tires. So your formula again is still changing quantity over the demanded changing quantity over demanded of good A over the percentage change in the price of good B. So this helps identify a relationship between different goods. So when we are classifying goods with cross elasticity, if we see a normal looking demand curve, that indicates to us that there is a negative cross elasticity. That means that there is a complement. So even though the price of our cars has gone up, the quantity demanded of tires has not changed or has in fact increased. Okay, so the price of good X increases and we look at how it impacts the demand for good Y. Okay, so if they have a negative relationship, in other words, a downward sloping demand curve, a normal looking demand curve, it means that they are complements. If, however, a price increase in good X results in a price of a demand increase in good Y, it means that they are substitute goods. Why? The price of one good has increased, so we are now buying the other product. There is also a zero cross elasticity, which is represented right here with this vertical line. That means that the price of good X can increase as much as it wants. It is not going to impact the demand for good Y. This depicts to us that they are completely independent of one another and have no relationship. Then we have price elasticity of supply, okay, PES. Now this measures how the quantity supplied responds to a change in price. Now you'll remember that on our supply curves, according to the law of supply, if the price increases, so will the demand increase as well. So the formula for price elasticity of supply is the percentage change in quantity supplied over the percentage change in price. Okay, so it's always positive because of the law of supply. Okay, so we haven't forgotten it. It is still there. Now, the significance of the price elasticity of supply, it indicates what producers are willing and able to produce. So it's not very easy, for example, if there is an increase in price, it's not always possible for producers to say, well, we're going to increase our production by 100% to take advantage of this new price. It takes time. So what is their ability to respond to these price changes? It affects these different price and market dynamics because if they are able to respond quickly, it means that they can take advantage of these price increases and they can generate additional revenue. Okay, that influences their producer surplus. It means that they are gaining more money than they would have determined or gotten if there was a perfectly efficient market at that time. It impacts all sorts of things like their output decisions, price determinations of their products, and salary determinations for their people. Remember, if those uh, employees start earning more, it means that there is additional demand entering the market as well. So there are different factors that affect price elasticity of supply. There are time periods for adjustments. Like we said, it takes time to re-equip your factory. The availability of inputs, it's very possible that all the raw materials you are getting from your suppliers takes time to replenish. So the simple availability of receiving it, for example, platinum stores can reach global lows, in which case increasing your production could be impacted by these massive, supply shocks. Storage capacity, how much can you have kept in inventory, in working capital, for example? What is your production capacity? Does increasing the number of units you produce, is it simply a case of increasing the number of people you employ, or is it actually re-equipping your entire factory? How do you think it impacts the supply of agricultural products? If there is an increase in the price of watermelon, of course, there are a lot of farmers who would want to take advantage of that. Unfortunately, how many of them can just, you know, create watermelons? Before the price and the market readjust to a new equilibrium, they could end up with a full, storage capacity of these products ready or just about ready to go into market. And then the price shifts back down because they're forced to flood the market into all competitors have moved in the same direction. So everybody's supplying the market, in which case they have created a surplus, which then pushes the price back down. So if you can't react fast enough, you could be left in a very difficult situation as well. So here you have a summary of all of these different types of price elasticity of demand. Here you can see, this is on table 6.4, also in your textbook, but here you have the standard price elasticity of demand. Here is your cross elasticity with all of the interpretations of the variables, income elasticity, and the interpretation of the good that you are looking at. And then you have price elasticity, which considers elasticity from the perspective of the producer. So we have this elasticity and market analysis. So it combines both demand and supply elasticities in the same way that we looked at aggregated demand and supply. In other words, demand and supply of different individuals all added together is what are represented by the market. So if we as producers and consumers can also look at how people and consumers are responding to our increases in price, we can, enable ourselves to take advantage of elasticities that move our way. Because like I showed you on that, let's see if we can just go back far enough. On this graph, you'll see that this represents one product, one demand. But depending on where you are on your demand curve, you could have a very different price elasticity of demand. So understanding where you are on this graph can help you make determinations about how to increase your total revenue. So this could be significant for your business. If you want to know if you are incorrectly determine what your market or your price elasticity is, and you incorrectly raise prices into an elastic demand, for example, you could devastate your company and then spend years recovering. On the other hand, if your competitors see that they have an inelastic demand and they start raising prices, they could also push you out of the market if you don't determine that there is a competitive advantage and you hand it to them by not acting yourself. So it's very important to consider all of these factors that influence your elasticity of your demand for the product that you intend to sell. You could be managing major corporations and simply by perfect example, Cura has just announced that they're going to delist from the JSC. They've seen a substantial number, a drop of enrollments. They did separate Stadio and Cura a few years ago. Stadio being their tertiary division and Cura being their schools division, but they have quite a high price point. And at a time when income constraints exist in South Africa and your middle class, which they specifically serve, is now shrinking and under substantial elasticity issues. They're now becoming highly elastic because can you really afford to pay the highest school fees? So people then started enrolling in cheaper schools because there are a great number of substitutes and simply income can't keep pace. So, if you can't adapt to the market that you find yourself in, very good chance that your business is going to struggle in the long run. So it is very useful for both policy analysis at a macro level and as well as a business strategy. Even personal finances can be drastically impacted by understanding how elastic your demand is. For example, if you are to put your child into a private school, that somewhat becomes inelastic because it is very difficult to move a child who has, for example, gone 9 years in a private school into a public school scenario in their last few years. So there is inelasticity. So in committing to that original contract, you have to think about 12 years. Same thing with a bond. Once you're in it, if your bond, if your, repo range, your interest rate goes up 3%, 5%, can you sacrifice your home? You have so much sunk costs. So you will have a very inelastic demand. You are very much at the will of your bank. Okay, so there are some key takeaways. Again, elasticity measures responsiveness in economic variables. There is price elasticity of demand is crucial for understanding our consumer behavior. So we look at it from an economic standpoint, but again, as I mentioned in the beginning, it is a very social science. So the advantage of economics is that we are almost pushed to approach every problem with a mixed methodology. We cannot just look at the numbers. So we cannot just say, the unemployment rates are high. Okay, that is a very subjective thing. High, what is that comparison? We can say positively that the unemployment rate is, say, 33% in our country. Okay, so now when we evaluate possible solutions from an economic standpoint, we have to look at both the social variables, the qualitative aspect, as well as the quantitative aspects. So that is essentially what price elasticity is also aiming to do. It is yet another economic variable that offers you this mixed methodology. You're not just formulaically looking at how a change in price impacts your change in demand, which of course is specifically very relevant to a micro business. You are also looking at how consumers are behaving. And because we are not just looking at the quantitative aspect, so, I see. If I raise my prices 10%, I'm going to have a substantial drop in price. Yes, perhaps in some economic circumstances, but it's not always relevant, consistently. So there are times when you will have your price elasticity change, and if you're not adaptive and even aware of it, you could be missing out on major opportunities your competitors are taking advantage of, or you could be drastically overestimating your market and actually limiting your demand by simply not pricing correctly. So, income and cross elasticities also offer additional insights into how consumers are classifying your goods. So it's very easy to understand that a lot of advertising is driven towards the classification of goods. For example, certain brands like Samsung have risen to almost premium status through a lot of advertising and brand manipulation. They have, positioned themselves as being a substitute to an iPhone almost, so they become a lot more expensive when they originally started as a very consumer friendly, um, very price reasonable product. But they have understood that as they started increasing the features in their phone, they were moving towards price inelasticity. As they started in the same way that Apple started creating your Apple environment where more and more of your products could connect to each other, they were increasing your inelasticity because now it's far more difficult to buy a brand that doesn't connect to your existing technological ecosystem. So it's very useful to understand from an income perspective, where on the demand curve do you fall? How do you also, by understanding that, you can reposition your brand like Samsung has. Many companies have done that. They've positioned themselves both moving upwards and downwards. For example, Toyota has their standard, family saloon that is their consumer-friendly, consumer-facing car, and then they have the Lexus brand, which is built on more luxury for the less income conscious consumers. Then you have with cross elasticities, again, you're considering what if we're looking even at cars and tires. Tire manufacturers consider the types of cars that are being produced before they start creating these um, replacement tires or these replacement parts years in advance. So, for example, they know that if 16,000 Hummers are going to be produced, this is a real scenario, um, before they shut down the Hummer plant in Newton, there were, say, 16,000 Hummers being produced in that plant in a particular year. The plant that was supplying the OE or the original equipment tires was Goodyear at the time. So they produced enough replacement tires for all of the 8,000 units that stayed in the country. So it is very useful to understand. Now, the reason that it was so significant with price cross elasticity is because there was a shutdown of the plant, the cross elasticity. So people then wanted to buy the last remaining Hummers that were being produced, but the tires were no longer going to be produced in the future. So there was a massive demand shock, and everybody wanted to store those tires for the future. So, despite the fact that the Hummers were increasing at the time, because they were complementary goods, the price of the tires rose as well, and the demand was not impacted at all. So it's fascinating that different economic scenarios and business scenarios can place you at different points on the demand curve, and understanding where you are allows you to, exploit your market and, ensure the long-term survival of your company. Or from a consumer standpoint, understand that, oh, okay, I'm in an inelastic situation. I'm going to require hedges to ensure that I don't end up in a situation where I could be exploited. Okay, so there are these different economic analyses that you can apply to all different facets of market participation. So then, of course, from a producer standpoint, it is extremely, important to understand how many products to supply to your market. If you oversupply in one year, you could, devastate your market by flooding it and bringing the price of your own product down. If, however, there's a massive market shortage and you are the person sitting with a whole lot of inventory in your warehouse, and because you're unaware of it, you don't take advantage of that price hike, and instead you end up only shipping out during a time of a depression of your price. So, it's all about maximizing your opportunities, and you can only do that if you can identify opportunities as they exist, because it takes quite a while to respond. So if you can anticipate it, you can position yourself to take advantage of it. So I'd love to find out what you find most intriguing about elasticity, how it could inspire different ideas in your areas of study. So please, drop me an email if you'd like to just chat. I have also created, I do want to just switch to that quickly. On your ARC site, forgive me for just a second. So on your ARC site, I have created under support for late-reg students. You have a quick little video here just catching you up on everything we've done from learning unit 1 to 3. And then I've created a little interactive simulation for you. Please tell me if you have any ideas on how to improve these or anything I can add. I've given you a few different types. Okay, just quick little simulations to help you actually apply the information you've learned in the different learning units. So please give them a try. You'll see I've included a different simulation or quiz to every learning unit. This is just a quick knowledge check to see how you're applying the information. Okay, this one is the one I actually wanted to explain. So this is a simulation of demand and supply. I thought this could be quite useful. The aim of this simulation is to try and get the yellow dot to be in line or on top of the blue dot. And in order to do that, you have to manipulate your price. You could see would act on your y-axis, and your quantity, which needs to be manipulated on your y-axis. And once you've gotten them perfectly over, you check for equilibrium and you get a score. In addition to that, you have a quick quiz below it just to check your understanding. The reason for this is because obviously demand and supply become the foundation of most things we do in economics. So it's very important that you grasp these very defined learning objectives. Make sure that you understand, and if you have any questions, please let me know. Okay, here again is a different variation. So this is demand and supply in action. So in this game, we've simulated a little lemonade stand. You can see how you set your supply and your original price. And you can see how your market is being impacted and what your demand and supply curves would look like. Okay, obviously, if you see that there is a point where your equilibrium is out of sync with your demand and supply curves, you can manipulate these to different levels and then stimulate your demand. See if you can stimulate it to a point where you reach equilibrium. Okay, relevant to today. Okay, you have a little elasticity game. Okay, so this is just checking your understanding. So if the price increases from $10 to $12, what does it increase by? Remember, you're using percentage change in price as your denominator and quantity demanded. So from 100 down to 80. What is the price elasticity of demand? You would simply put the quantity demanded, so that is -20 over price increases. That's again 20, an increase in 20. We do not consider any negatives with regards to elasticity. Let's see if we're correct. It's 1.1.2, so you will get the correct answer as well. Okay, then once you have provided the correct answer, you can move on to the next question, and you can just test yourself here and make sure that you can apply the formula. Okay, guys, that will be concluding our lecture. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I have marked assignments from all of our BCom entrepreneurship students. We have been granted an extension for our BCom students. So please not to worry if you've got any questions related to your assignment. I have also provided you with here some tips to ace the assignments. It's just a quick little video. And under formative 1, you have a link to your actual assignment as well as YouTube videos just to support you through the assignment, as well as an overview and then a review of the questions in a little bit more detail. But again, I am here to support you. So if you have any issues, please just let me know. Okay, with that, I'm going to conclude tonight's session. Thank you guys so much for joining me, and I hope you have a wonderful week ahead. All the best for your submissions, and have a wonderful evening. God bless.